Alrighty. Well, I'm likely to keep making some of these drive time videos because I think it's a good use of the the big daily drive that I make, where I just sit here in silence. Anyway, I want to talk a bit about the pros and cons of Aboriginal women as wives and mothers, and maybe a few bits and bobs on interracial marriages. Now, a lot of the ones you'll see in the city areas, or even the areas that just aren't the desert/outback, it's quite surprising how many of them are indeed a good part white. And all the same, you know, many of them who are part white often still marry other Aboriginals who are also partly white. And there's not really, it's not terribly common for white people here to marry black people, especially ones who are 100% black, you know, because the cultural differences are sort of fairly vast, or can be seen as that way. It's, you know, you can say, like, parts of where I grew up, you know, that Aboriginals and whites are friends, but there's sort of, it depends. Some of them, they just sort of don't want to know about you, and others are rather friendly. And in general, they are very friendly, but they've often, due to a part of their culture that sort of says that what's mine is yours, this whole sort of tribal sharing thing, that you got to, you know, share everything, they sort of end up asking for money quite a lot, and it puts a lot of people off quite badly, you know. You know, and there has been culture incompatibilities. You're talking about a culture here where some say 40,000 years, but many will say 5,000 years. It never changed. And you compare that to a culture whose cell phones change every year. You know, there's a bit of a, difference there. I'm not saying that nothing ever happened bad amongst their culture and they all lived happily in this, you know, they fought amongst each other and stuff like that, but sort of we come here and I tell you what, the worst thing we could have ever done was give them alcohol. At one point, my parents remember living through this point, they used to originally pay them usually in meat and flour when they would employ them in the outback. My parents never employed them, but that was generally the custom, was you'd trade goods for a certain amount of days' work, you know, and they work well and they're absolutely brilliant as stock people on these massive outback ranches, which we call stations, you know, and yeah, but at some point there, the unions got involved during the 1970s. My parents remember when all this happened, and forced them to be paid money. And then, of course, the only thing you can buy in these towns, for all the lack of everything in the outback, you've got an astronomical amount of alcohol. And it just goes against everything else, you know. You're paying not $3 a gallon for diesel, you're paying $3 for a quarter gallon of diesel in these areas. Everything's highly priced. But there's no shortage of beer. It's just, you know. So anyway, they get a paycheck instead of getting meat and flour. And what's the easiest available thing? Alcohol. It did not do them good. In fact, many of the Aboriginal elders realised this back in the day. And of course, it only took the government another bloody 40 years to realise the same thing, and several years ago they've put very heavy alcohol restrictions in areas in the northern parts of Australia, particularly the northern part of Western Australia. And having not a prohibition but not too far off a prohibition is unbelievably alleviated a lot of their troubles. There's the one thing we done that I think was terrible, you know, was give them alcohol, because it almost caused a collapse of their society. In some areas it essentially did cause a collapse of their society, you know. So it's one of these things. Then there's become this sort of a stereotype that's developed that, you know, Aboriginals are drunks, you know, and it's not always the case. But there's sort of that bad image that's gone with it, and in some areas it's absolutely atrocious, you know, and these are the areas that the government's focused on. And, you know, I wonder if with their bending over to the unions and passing of these laws that forced everyone to take, black and white, to take cash only, so that then they could tax you, you know, if that wasn't partly to blame for all this, these alcohol problems. But there has been, and I was told this directly by an Aboriginal guy I work with, a fairly close link between alcohol, domestic violence and suicide. You know, and you clean up the alcohol and a lot of the other things alleviate. But it has left, you know, people assuming they're all drunks. And I saw all that sort of stuff in my childhood, you know. And it's, you know, that's been unfortunately the case. You will see, I mean, if you type in Aboriginal women into the search bar in YouTube, and you can try this, guess what the very next recommended word comes up? Fighting. There's a lot of videos of them fighting, you know, and you may assume, well, you know, they're drunks, they fight a lot, this, that, blah, blah. And there are some who are, you know, down that path of a lot of arguing and punching and carrying on, but there's others who aren't, you know, and they're very different from what you'd expect with white girls. Now, as an off-gridder, one of the things that I notice the most with Aboriginal girls is they have no trouble with low standards of living. You know, to me, that is music to my ears, to not have to... You go on these dating sites and you got girls there who, you know, they can't live without their blooming cable TV, you know, their air conditioning, everything just perfect, this, that and the other. And some of these Aboriginal girls, you know, the conditions they live in are frickin' primitive. You know, they'd be... Some of them would be experiencing an upgrade if they come and live with me, honestly, you know, and the housing standard would rise when they come and live with me, with the gaps in me ceiling and everything like that, you know, and they're never fussy, really speaking. I'm not saying completely. I mean, your 95% white ones will be, but you know, proper Aboriginals, you know, majority Aboriginal ones will happily live with fairly low standards. Another thing I've noticed which shines through with these girls every time, you know, at the moment I'm living in an area that has almost none, except these, you know, ones that are, honestly, some of them look whiter than me. But funnily enough, I've been in places where there have been ones who are, you know, a good deal Aboriginal, a quarter Aboriginal or more, And somehow I just end up coming across them, and we start talking, and it'll be another 3 hours more of talking, you know, and like honestly they are the friendliest girls in the world, you know, and it's just, you know, you can't believe it. I've walked down the street and I've seen white girls who look at me dressed in my work clothes, and they sort of, you see their nose lift in the air, you know, it's like their nose sort of slightly rises like, oh, well, I'm better than you. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, you know how much I'm worth? I know you're worth a negative amount because of all your credit card debt. I'm worth a lot more than you, yet you're walking around like you're better than me. You know, and you just, it's just snobbery, you know. And this is what you get with white girls in the capital. Once upon a time, I met an Aboriginal girl in the capital, and we hung around for hours. And at the time, I was looking after someone else's flat, and in fact, she ended up coming back to the flat. And in fact, she ended up staying there the night. I mean, we didn't do any of that, but, you know, she stayed there overnight. I ended up going to work late the next day, and I said, oh, I had an Aboriginal girl that was at me place. And like, oh, did you shag her? And I'm like, no, but just she slept there overnight. And this is how it can go with these girls. They're so trusting, they're so friendly. You meet them on the street, and that night they're sleeping at your house. And you say, but Link, you know, you don't go out and you don't talk to any other white girls that hang around with them and this and that. Yeah, you're right. But this is Aboriginal girls. This is what they're like. They're so friendly. They're so nice. You know, and it's one of these things that, you know, you keep them away from the alcohol and they've got real potential, you know. They do have health issues. Really speaking, a lot of it's not just alcohol, it's really sugar. They are no good with sugar at all, to the point that, and none of them really seem to realise that none of them really, you know, there's not a big push on to stop them getting into sugar, but well, because the government's more interested in them keeping out of alcohol, they're not too worried about sugar. But, and this is a statistic, 50% of them are diabetics by age 55. They just really don't run well with sugar, you know. And you see the build of a lot of them. A lot of the women, they tend to have a bit of weight on, you know, and I put it down to blooming sugar and stuff like that. That there's quite a few of them that have a bit of weight on board. I'll talk a bit. Oh, you know, we're going to cover everything. Stuff it. Link says what he you know, decides should be said. So we're going to cover even the body and the build and some of the things of these girls. Now, there's a lot of people out there who, you know, there's that knee-jerk sort of a thing, and generally speaking, it's true, that will tell you that Aboriginal women ain't pretty. In fact, I've seen some even claim they're Neanderthal. You know, and maybe you can associate that with some of the old girls who are like 75 plus, but what they basically mentioned in this post, and what a lot of people automatically assume, is that they're ugly. Well, prettiness, for me, prettiness has never been a problem, you know, and you know, I remember my uncle once saying, oh, I have trouble when I'm in the welfare office and the girl over the counter talking to me is a bit pretty because, you know, I let my guard down. And I said, well, you know, I get a pretty girl, you know, I can look them straight in the face and hold the gun under the table if need be. You know, I don't lose my guard one bit with a pretty girl, you know, and really prettiness doesn't mean much to me. And I'll be honest, you know, there's a good deal of them there, 80% that are average to ugly. But you sort of, you know, and it might be 70% are average or ugly. And you know, the thing is though, you get this sort of upper 10% of them who are bloody gorgeous, you know, and I've seen, there's a particular Aboriginal girls' school, and you know they had a few photos of the students up. The two girls there from the same tribe. One of them's gorgeous. The other one, you know, I'm not being disrespectful to them or anything like that, but I reckon if she met a wild pig, it wouldn't be her running from the wild pig. It'd be the other way around. You know, and you just think, how can two girls from the same tribe, who are probably cousins or something, one be so pretty and one be so ugly, you know, and you can't really make it up, but it's the way it goes. But you know, once again, just as you can stereotype that a lot of them fight, or a lot of them are into, you know, a bit too much alcohol, you can also say that you know, there's ones that ain't good looking, have quite a bit of weight on, and usually ain't very busty. Now, the busty thing is a very interesting thing I've noticed. It's quite surprising. Your typical Aboriginal will be very, well, particularly when they're younger and that, and, you know, younger women and some of the men and all that, they're very tall, almost lanky tall, and thin. But as the years roll on, I don't know if it's sugar or it's menopause, and it may be just menopause, you know, the weight really stacks on. You know, and some of them are just like that even when they're in their 20s. They have a fair bit of weight in their 20s, but they seem to usually only be, well, probably a B cup or something like that. Now, there's a very strange effect though. When they have a bit of white in them, I mean, they only need to be like about a quarter white or something like that. Strangely enough, you can go from grandmother, mother, you know, B cup, and then you get to the, you know, the third generation, and she might be half white or a quarter white or 3/4 white or something like this. All of a sudden, you throw those white genetics in, and what do you know? All of a sudden you've got double D cups and bigger. In fact, in American bra cup sizes, you're talking E, F and double F. I'm not joking. It seems somehow that you can get, you know, a bit of white genes mixed in with those Aboriginal genes, and fairly often they will be surprisingly busty. And you're just like, what happened here? Well, I don't know. Somehow it's just a mix of the two genes tends to produce, you know, and it mightn't be all of them, but, you know, I can tell you what, it's at least a quarter of them, end up being very busty. It's just bizarre how that happens. Some of the ones in Western Australia are very pretty. There's quite a few in Western Australia who tend to be fairly pretty. And there's another thing you'll see that is really only sort of a particular thing with their genetics is some of them have legs that look really thin, and it happens a lot in Western Australia, but I've heard of some even in, you know, just over the border in New South Wales, in Broken Hill, one was, where they have these really skinny legs, and you look at them, and their legs are so thin, it's almost like, holy smoke, how thin are your legs? Particularly the lower half of their legs, they're so thin, you're like, how don't they, you know, trip over and snap their leg or something? It's, yeah, it's different. You wouldn't have seen it until you've seen it, you know. But that's just sort of some of the things. Now, another thing that, and this is where, you know, this is a big part of their downfall in terms of just the respect they get treated, or the lack of respect they get, more to the point. You have sort of, they talk in a sort of fairly simple, childlike manner at times. Not all of them, you know, but quite a number of them, they'll, you know, they'll talk very simple. And you'll be talking to them and just the words they use, and it's almost like you're talking to an 8-year-old or something, you know, and they're just, oh, this happened and that happened, and that, you know, you'll have a very simple sort of a conversation from them. Some guy's driving along with a bunch of sparks coming out behind his vehicle there. I don't know what's going on there. And it's sort of, you know, and the honest fact is that there's a number of them who are naive, and quite a lot, you know, who are naive, and they talk very simple, almost childlike, you know, and that sort of, I hate to say it, but they're perceived as stupid, and, you know, then get treated like a dumb bitch, you know, and that in many parts does them a lot of harm. And they are indeed naive, you know, they are so easily conned into sex, you know, and I mean, but they're so friendly and so relaxed that, you know, these are some of the unfortunate things that happen is they get conned into sex easily, used up, spat out. So many of them, so many of them get beaten up by their partners. And it's really quite sad, you know, because it's almost like they were innocent, they were well-meaning, and they got, you know, shagged like a blimmin' rag doll, you know, and then beaten up, and then, you know, just basically they get used and abused so much that it is really quite sad. A lot of the, you know, and as a result also there's a lot of teenage pregnancies, and, you know, there's ones that, oh, holy smoke, there's ones that have even had babies at age 12, you know, and some of the statistics and stuff you hear, it's just like going to fucking Africa sometimes. You know, you look at some of these places that they live in out in the desert, and it's slums. Why doesn't the government build them houses? Yeah, well, there's been a tendency that they have, and then, you know, one drunken night these things get smashed up. 5 years later they're, you know, not looking very good at all, these houses, you know. But of course that's associated with alcohol problems, you know. And how much do people value something if they never had to pay for it? You know. One of them things, but yeah, it is very sad and very unfortunate that because of their naivety and you know, their perceived stupidity, and some of them, I suppose you could say, if they're naive, that might make them stupid, and sort of just their innocence and their willingness and their friendliness, it just all gets taken advantage of far too often, far too often. Almost indefinitely, well, 100% definitely to the detriment of the girl in question. You know, and it's a sad situation, but yeah, there is a tradition there that, you know, they do love their kids, but all too many times there's, you know, they have kids taken off them and stuff like that, and, you know, there's a fair bit of neglect and stuff like that of kids. You know, there's the stolen generation. You can look that up, and you'll probably see some highly left-wing motivated version of events, but as a kid, we had a pastor who was part of the stolen generation, you know, and as much as he said he loved his parents, he was left to fend for himself. He had to drink water from mud puddles. That was what he was drinking water from, you know, and as much as they love their kids, there's sort of they don't sort of really bring them up with the care and attention that you will otherwise see. And it's still happening. It's still happening even today, you know, and there's a lot of sort of government intervention that is attempted that's then fought back by left-wing activists who in a number of cases has led to the deaths of children today, not you know, back in 1950s, but today, you know, and it's a bit of a messy situation, but yeah, you know, there's sort of, you got to realise that it's been a very simplistic culture for 5,000 years, and you've got girls who, you know, have become very simple with a very simple view on life and a simple way of looking at things because of 5,000 years of a simple life. And that's, you know, I really believe that in part culture is kind of bred into you. You know, and yeah, I've seen a case of, you know, well, I mean, if I don't name names, nobody's getting too worried, but I saw, and I was friends with a woman who was a quarter Aboriginal. Now, she'd been adopted as a baby straight into a wealthy white family, but so much of what she done, how she talked, and how she thought was Aboriginal, very much so. She once said to my mother, "Tell me a bit about the Aboriginal culture, I don't know anything about them." And it's like, well, go look in the mirror and you'll see a lot of Aboriginal culture coming out in you. One of the things they do, and my mother was stunned because she hadn't seen this since they'd, you know, been up around the northern parts of Western Australia, was they hang clothes, not on the clothesline, they hang it on the sheep fencing. And she went past the house and there all the clothes are all hanging on the sheep fencing, and she's like, oh my gosh, I haven't seen that since the Aboriginal women in northern WA. And she'd never seen it either. The woman who hung the clothes out had never seen it either. But somehow, even though she's a quarter Aboriginal and had been brought up with a rich white family, she thought, oh, this is a logical choice that instead of having to raise my arms up and put these clothes up higher, why don't I just hang them on the sheep fence? And she went ahead and hung them on the sheep fence. She's been removed from that culture from the day she was born, placed in a rich white family living in a 3-story house right in the middle of the city, and yet parts of the culture still come out, you know, and you know, at times, you know, of course these differences in culture cause disagreements, but I think so long as you know, and a lot of them smoke smoke quite a bit as well, and I'm just talking cigarettes, and you know, let's face it, out in some of these areas, you know, they've got into marijuana a fair bit as well. But I think it's one of these things, they're very susceptible to vices, you know, both men and women, and if they're kept away from all that shit and kept away from large amounts of sugar or even small amounts of sugar, you know, I think and sort of maybe even guarded a bit so they don't get duped into things because of their naivety, they don't sign up for, you know, ridiculous contracts or whatever. I think otherwise you're looking at a fairly worthwhile woman for marriage, you know. They're never fussy about anything. Like, really speaking, they never whinge about anything materialistic, you know. If they've got a car and the wheels are turning, it doesn't worry them if half the fabrics on the seat is gone. They'll just throw a blooming towel on the seat and it's all good, you know. And it's surprising at how non-materialistic they are. And honestly, to me, that is a breath of fresh air that I, you know, like nothing else, you know. You talk to so many guys who have their wives go out and spend like crazy on shoes and clothes and shit they don't need, you know, and just all this high expectation living drives the guy into debt, you know, and when he finally can't pay it anymore because he can't borrow any more money, then he gets divorced. And let's face it, that is the story for a lot of middle and upper middle class America, you know, and it's not quite as bad here, but make no bones about it, the divorce rate isn't a great deal better here than it is in America. You know, it might be 75% in America, but my sister says just from the people she knows, it's got to be at least 50% here. But, you know, this is the thing. You know, you've sort of... That's a huge factor to someone like me, you know. They are, I'll be perfectly honest, because we're being honest here, they are quite lazy. Or they can be. You got some who do work hard, but there is a tendency amongst the whole culture to be lazy. And don't look at it as they're lazy. Look at the structure that we're set up in. I can see this a lot better as an off-gridder. You know, quite a bit better than most people as an off-gridder. Because I'm an off-gridder. Look at the structure that we're set up. We're set up to live in, you know, a place where they charge you big dollars for land, whereas land was owned by everybody in Aboriginal culture, and even a lot of the island nations surrounding Australia, even ones further out past New Zealand, you know, land is owned by the tribe, not individually. But here we are, cutting it all up into little squares and slices and selling it and buying it for astronomical prices. You know, people spend 30 years working 5 days or 6 days a week to pay for some little bloody block that you can walk around in less than a minute, and they spend most of their working life paying for it. Just let's think about it. Just think about it. Let it sink in for a second. You got a block of land that you can walk around in 35 seconds, and you have spent 30 years of your life paying for that shit. See what's going on? Our culture and taxes and, you know, the move away from the old days where people would have their own individual farming plots, like the yeomanry, who weren't like the serfs and peasants who didn't own their own land, but the yeomanry, which I am directly descended from, were people who owned small plots of land that was enough to grow their food to keep themselves, you know, and have a handful more in better years that they could sell, you know. And we've gone from that sort of a self-sufficient agriculture sort of existing, you know, and honestly there weren't many yeomanry. It was, you know, mainly a culture of the rich and the poor peasant. But we've gone from sort of, you know, in some cases better times, to, you know, this structured existence, and that's been bred into our society for the last 100 years, probably since the days of serfdom, you know, where you have your rich and then you've got your workers who flog their guts out all their life just to have a small patch that they're on, you know, who are deliberately farming and planting versus hunter-gatherer mentality, or, you know, hunter-gatherer ways of feeding yourself, you know, and the culture never required them to work. They didn't have to work, so they didn't. They just lived off the land versus cutting everything up, segmenting everything, putting ownership to everything, and putting a price tag on everything. You know, and that's led us to the society we're in today. And some of them, you know, people, they're so indoctrinated in this society that we're in now that they think it's the absolute #1 best. And of course you got all the consumer gadgets of the bloody world, but hands up how many people want to keep getting up at 6 AM on Saturday to go to work? Yeah. Is it all it cracked up to be if you've got to work most of the days of your bloody life for a good hunk of your life? You know, their culture avoided all that. So you can look at it as lazy, or you can look at it as their culture being shockingly different, and it is. And there's aspects of their culture that are good, and, you know, depending on the way you look at it, that could be a good part. You might also say, oh yeah, but they didn't have modern medicine and that. And you'd also be right, they didn't have modern medicine and luxuries, but how many luxuries did we create that, essentially speaking, were only luxuries we had to make, like driving vehicles, to accommodate the fact that we got to work 5 or 6 days a week. Yeah. So, you know, create a problem, then find a solution to the problem, and then turn around and go, well, we're so good because we have this great solution to a problem that we sort of generated ourselves in our own culture. This might be a real red pill moment, but it's just something that probably should be thrown out there if we're talking about Aboriginals. You know. But anyway, it's some of these areas I might be looking at houses in, areas that, you know, I'm going to come across a few of these young lasses, and inevitably, as usual, I always end up talking to them, and maybe that'll stop my endless search for a nice young lass with potential to have a family with.